Chapter 5 The Young Republic Part 1 Getting Started 1789 to 1801. Although the young American Republic had a new constitution, it was a very slender affair, outlining very little of what we've come to understand today as government. That was just as well. Its brevity sufficed to bring renewed unity to the competitive-minded states, and its vagueness in detail left exactly just those details to be developed by the individuals who would take their place as officers in the new republic. George Washington. It was understood and expected by all, except perhaps by Washington himself, who, after the war, was looking forward to ending his public duties and heading back to his farm at Mount Vernon to enjoy a less frustrating set of labors, that the person to lead the Republic as its new president was George Washington. After some soul-searching, he once again yielded to the call of duty, when it was apparent that no one else but him was expected to be the country's new leader. Thus, on April 30th, 1789, he stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City to take the oath of office as the Republic's first president. How would he handle the office? There were a multitude of problems facing the new Republic, none of them particularly military, at least for the moment, and so his sole experience as a military officer would not give much indication as to how he would handle the challenges of civil office. The Constitution mentions only that a president is chosen for a 4-year term, but elected officials in the colonies could be, and frequently were, repeatedly returned to office with a new election. Would he leave after serving only 4 years? Would he want to stay on repeatedly like a monarch, ruling until he drew his last breath? Some bitter anti-federalists even claimed that Washington would try to make himself king, although those who knew him well were quite aware that this would be the last thing that Washington would have wanted for himself. In any case, how would he get things started as president? What kind of legacy would he leave for others to live up to and develop? The answer came quickly as he gathered together a small group of advisors to whom he could assign particular functions, a group or council similar to the English royal cabinet. Although the Constitution mentions no such institution, Washington, and all presidents after him, chose to make very important use of a cabinet of officials, some serving as personal advisors and some serving as heads or secretaries of government institutions that American presidents have long used to administer the office of president. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. Once again he called on the one person he trusted most for hard work and natural brilliance of mind and bravery, the one person he had relied on time and time again in the years of the war, Alexander Hamilton. With the financial status of the new republic being the new Union's biggest challenge, Washington was quick to assign Hamilton as the United States' first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton was actually born, year uncertain, not in one of the American colonies, but in the Caribbean, under peculiar family circumstances that would be the object of much commentary by his later political enemies, and was forced to look after his own survival at a very early age. Footnote. His mother was married, but separated from another man when she met and married, thus illegally, James Hamilton, Alexander's presumed father. When her legal status was brought to light, James left her and young Alexander. Then, when Alexander was only 13, his mother died, leaving Alexander an orphan. End of footnote. But he was a very avid reader, bilingual, English and French, and a self-educated apprentice, clerking for a local merchant, possibly his actual father. And at 17 wrote an essay published in the local newspaper. The essay was sufficiently impressive that local community leaders gathered a fund to send Hamilton off to New Jersey in 1772 for formal education, that is, prep school. In 1773, he began his studies at King's College, that is, Columbia University, in New York, where he quickly distinguished himself as an excellent orator, supporting the colony's growing spirit of rebellion against British royal authority. Hamilton also wrote at the same time a number of outstanding articles and essays in support of the same cause. Yet he was also of a cautious or fair mind, perhaps because of his own sufferings as a youth, and in May of 1775 came to the defense of the college president, allowing the man to escape an angry mob, while Hamilton challenged the mob not to attack loyalists or their cause in this manner. However, Hamilton was himself quick to take up arms and join with friends in the New York militia, undertaking at the same time, again on his own initiative, the study of military history and military tactics, and soon put that knowledge to use in leading a raid on a supply of British cannons in the battery. He then went on to organize his own artillery company, elevating himself thereby to the rank of captain. His company soon joined with Washington's troops in the various battles that raged across New York City and then across New Jersey, where his artillery kept the Hessians under fire at the Battle of Trenton. His talents were quickly recognized, and he was asked by various generals to join their staff. Yet he understood that glory was to be found on the field of battle, not on the general staff of a commanding general. That is, until Washington made the same request. That was an offer that Hamilton was willing to accept, and this changed his life and America's forever. As chief of staff, he was assigned the task of maintaining written communications with the Continental Congress, the governors of the new states, and with other generals. Over the course of 4 years, as Washington's confidence in Hamilton became virtually total, Hamilton himself issued detailed military instructions to officers under Washington's command, and supervised both diplomatic and intelligence operations coming from Washington's command. Thus it was that he met French General the Marquis de Lafayette and became close friends with him in the process. Finally, at Yorktown, Hamilton's long desire to actually serve directly under fire came into play, with Washington's very hesitant permission. It was Hamilton himself who led the American attack on one of the two vital redoubts still holding the British line in the latter's desperate defense at Yorktown. It was a brave, but probably very foolish, move on Hamilton's part. But he obviously survived, adding even more to his enormous stature in the eyes of Washington. After the war, he formed a law partnership with a friend and found himself, among other things, defending Tories who were suffering from the post-war anti-British backlash, typical of his sense of fairness. But he was nonetheless very interested in seeing his new republic move forward into its own distinct future, and thus in 1784 founded the Bank of New York, the beginning of his entry into the world of large-scale financing. He was as interested in the political future of the country as its financial future, and 2 years later attended the Annapolis Convention, drafting the resolution which called for the Constitutional Convention that eventually produced the U.S. Constitution. The next year, he became an assemblyman in the New York State Legislature, which sent him as one of its 3 representatives to the convention in Philadelphia. And of course, it was he who wrote many of the articles that formed the famous Federalist Papers, advocating the adoption of the new Constitution. Washington had not forgotten Hamilton and the military service he had performed for him. He knew Hamilton to be intensely loyal personally, intensely brave, intensely intelligent, intensely competent, and intensely dedicated to serving his newly independent country. And thus it was that Washington turned to Hamilton to see what Hamilton could do to help him put the new country on a strong financial footing. He wanted Hamilton to become his Secretary of the Treasury, that is, the nation's first. As it had always been during the war, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, problem facing Washington and the struggling young republic he was expected to lead was money. Always money. The currency issued during the war was now almost worthless. The war had run up huge debts for most of the states, and the young republic faced bankruptcy and failure if this problem could not be brought under some kind of management. Hamilton's debt assumption program. Hamilton, however, had some well-developed ideas as to how he wanted to meet that challenge. Promissory notes or bonds issued during the war by the Continental Congress, by the various states, and by the Army, totaling over $100 million, had been bought up by speculators after the war at 15 cents on the dollar. Most people believed that they were not even worth that much. In other words, the creditworthiness of the Republic was almost nil. Hamilton proposed to Congress, January of 1790, a method of clearing the debt by which he called assumption. The federal government would assume all of the debts and begin the process of repaying them at full value. America would pay its debts. The world could take confidence in that. It was indeed financial confidence that Hamilton was trying to restore. To meet this obligation, the Republic would itself borrow, issuing its own promissory notes or bonds to cover the debt, through bonds issued by a newly created national bank, the Bank of the United States, or BUS. Besides financing the repayment of the national debt, the BUS would also fund public economic infrastructure projects and private industrial investment for national development. Hamilton's program was designed to found the nation not on the democratic whims of the masses, but the hard-nosed realism of the moneyed class that commanded the American economy. Understanding the mindset of America's moneyed class, Hamilton's plan was to involve this class in the new government by inviting wealthy financiers to exchange the old Continental Congress's bonds with the Republic's new bonds. This would give these individuals a very strong financial interest in seeing the new government succeed. And, most importantly, it would place the new government's finances on very strong foundations. This made great sense for a republic trying to establish itself as a serious, viable institution in a dangerously competitive world. But the reaction to his proposal was swift. Resistance. This immediately put a split in the country that would last through the coming generations between the essentially rural southern and western regions of the country, on the one hand, and the up east, urban industrial region of Yankee New England and the middle states. Farmers had a deep loathing for banks, even though necessary in order to purchase property. Then there was the matter of paying off speculators on debts originally owed to the foot soldiers who had been paid for their wartime services with the almost worthless notes. Paying speculators full value for these notes bought on the cheap from penniless citizens seemed very unfair, sort of a double slap in the face of America's small heroes. And there was also the irritation of the states, such as Virginia, which had paid off its own debts in full. Why should they be part of a program assuming the debt of the states that had not done what they had done? Growing political division. There was a lot of anger that arose over Hamilton's program. Jefferson was most vocal in his indignation at Hamilton's idea of debt assumption. This, in fact, pushed Jefferson into an ever stronger states' rights, or anti-federalist position. And it cost Hamilton his friendship with Madison, who, as a former Federalist, now turned into an equally dedicated supporter of an anti-Federalist group headed up by his fellow Virginian Jefferson. As it turned out, Washington threw his support behind his Treasury Secretary, and Congress moved ahead to approve Hamilton's program. And indeed, it did put the new republic on fairly firm financial footing. But it had opened a wide political wound between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that would not be healed. As Madison himself had forecast, and in the Federalist Papers had justified as necessary to the proper functioning of a representative government, America took its first steps towards a two-party political system. Hamilton's Federalists in competition with Jefferson's Anti-Federalists, who, under Madison's tutelage, would organize themselves as the Republicans. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1791-1794. Meanwhile, to raise revenue to pay off the newly assumed debts, Hamilton placed an excise tax on the production of whiskey, a basic essential in the diet of the American farmers, and also a means of currency in the farmers' businesses. The new tax met with the same resistance that had George III's 1773 tea tax imposed on his American subjects to pay for his wars. Westerners from upstate New York through western Pennsylvania into Ohio and Kentucky, western Maryland, and the western Carolinas all got involved in the refusal to submit to Hamilton's tax. Washington agreed with Hamilton that the toleration of such insubordination would collapse the authority of the Republic. It was a hard thing to do, to come up against these strong souls, many of whom had fought alongside Washington in the War of Independence, a war that had had similar roots in its resistance against George III's new taxes. But ultimately the question was not about taxes, for a government cannot operate without an income stream of some kind, but about the legality of those taxes. King George III had imposed his taxes on the colonies not merely as a needed source of financing for his kingdom, but as a show of royal authority over colonial subjects that had become too self-sufficient, too independent-minded. This was not Hamilton's purpose in issuing the new whiskey taxes. The Republic needed everyone involved in the support of their new government, not just the private investors, in order for the Republic to succeed and not fail. And finally, just as in the need to maintain discipline in a wartime army, the Republic would fail in peacetime unless it too could get compliance to its laws properly or legally instituted and properly enforced. Lack of political discipline would certainly destroy the Republic, just as events in Paris at that time, that is, the French Reign of Terror, were making quite clear. Street mobs in Paris had taken control of the effort to birth the new French Republic, and it was looking increasingly likely that the French Republic was thus going to fail in its efforts to get itself established. The same threat seemed to hang over the young American Republic at this point. Thus, in August of 1794, Washington led a 13,000-man army into western Pennsylvania to confront protesters, who quickly melted away at the appearance of Washington and his army. The show of force broke the rebellion. The authority of the government was thus confirmed, but the event only deepened the distrust by the rural Westerners and Southerners of the money-loving up East Federalists. The Kentucky question. This event and the growing regional distrust would register itself clearly in the form of a dispute when Kentucky applied for statehood. The Up East Federalists dragged their feet, fearing that they would be overwhelmed in Congress by a growing Southern-Western coalition lined up against them. Finally, a compromise was reached in 1791 when New England's Vermont was admitted to the Union, opening the way in 1792 for Kentucky to be admitted as a new state, as a counterbalancing principle in the politics of statehood, a principle that would be applied again and again as the country struggled over deep cultural differences that separated the various regions of the country. Thomas Jefferson. Washington had appointed Jefferson to his cabinet as his Secretary of State, charged with overseeing America's diplomatic missions abroad and, supposedly, advising Washington on foreign policy matters as the need arose. Jefferson would not be easy to work with. Jefferson was born to a Virginia planter family with important family ties, especially on the side of his mother, Jane Randolph, a cousin of Peyton Randolph, who was a leading political figure of Virginia during the 1760s and 1770s. Footnote. Randolph was Speaker of the Virginia House of Burgesses, 1766 to 1769, was the President of the First Continental Congress, 1774, and President of the Virginia Convention, debating independence from Britain, 1775, just before his death that year. End of footnote. At an early age, Jefferson was tutored along with the Randolph children, and as a youth, in classic aristocracy fashion, he was taught Latin, Greek, and French, along with history, science, and the classics. At age 16, he entered the College of William and Mary, where he continued his study of these same disciplines. He graduated 2 years later to begin his study of law under the prominent George Wythe. And at age 21, he inherited 5,000 acres from his deceased father's estate, including Monticello, where a few years later he began the building of a mansion of his own design. He was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767, and as a practicing lawyer, represented his county as a delegate to the House of Burgesses in the period 1769 to 1775. In 1772, he married third cousin Martha and settled into a period that was perhaps the happiest of his life. In the 10 years of their marriage, she bore him 6 children, only 2 of which survived to adulthood. Footnote. Already sick from diabetes and her frequent childbirths, she died in 1782 at age 33 in delivering their 6th child. They also inherited from her father another 11,000 acres and 135 slaves to work the land, and a heavy debt that accompanied the title. When he was sent to represent Virginia at the Second Continental Congress in 1775, he befriended John Adams, and thus was invited to join the committee assigned the task, supposedly Adams' responsibility, of drafting a Declaration of Independence, the startup version which was ultimately assigned to Jefferson. Some changes were subsequently made to Jefferson's draft by the committee, then by the full Congress. About a fourth of the whole was cut out, including a section connecting King George and the slave trade. At the same time, the Declaration seemed to be a much less significant matter than all of the new state constitutions being drafted by the 13 newly independent states. Shortly after this, September of 1776, he was elected to the new Virginia House of Delegates, where he served on the committee working on the new Virginia Constitution and sponsored the bill for establishing religious freedom that is, forbidding state support of religious institutions or doctrines, which, however, failed to pass. 2 years later, he was given the responsibility of reviewing and editing Virginia's system of laws, and the year after that, 1779, he was elected as the state's governor, undertaking at that point to institute new laws in pursuit of his personal worldview concerning religion, education, property rights. When in 1781, Benedict Arnold, now serving the British, attacked the new Virginia capital at Richmond, Jefferson and members of the Assembly were able to escape to Monticello, and Richmond was burned to the ground. Then, when Cornwallis approached Monticello, escaped from there to another of his plantations to the west. Footnote. It was later that year decided by the Assembly that Jefferson had acted appropriately, but he had lost such stature that he was not re-elected governor. End of footnote. After the war, 1783, he became a delegate to the Confederation Congress, where he chaired the committee that drafted the 1784 Land Ordinance, removing the Northwest Territories from the ongoing land title conflicts among the states by making them territories eventually eligible to become states of their own. Also, slavery was to be allowed in these 9 territories. Footnote. His anti-slavery provision was not approved at the time, though reintroduced and subsequently approved when the 9 territories were consolidated into 5 territories, the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and moved forward towards the original goal with the passage of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. In 1784, he was sent to join Franklin and Adams in Europe in the effort to negotiate trade agreements with England, France, and Spain. Franklin returned to the States the next year. Jefferson quickly made himself at home among the French, befriending the Marquis de Lafayette in his effort to develop improved trade relations between the United States and France. He also fell in love with the French lifestyle, including his wines and books. Then, soon after the French Revolution broke out in July of 1789, he returned to the States, intending, however, to return soon to Paris. But the request by Washington to serve as his new Secretary of State, charged with the primary responsibilities of supervising the country's diplomatic mission, caused him to remain in America. But this would bring him into direct contact with Hamilton, a man whose views Jefferson, by instinct, opposed on virtually every front. Hamilton was very supportive of a strong central government, able to unify the functioning of the 13 states, politically as well as economically. This Jefferson opposed strongly, fearing that such a strong central authority would compromise greatly the states' rights to conduct their own affairs as they chose. He was thus highly opposed to the concept of a national authority, that is, until he himself later became president of that very same nation. Furthermore, unlike the almost spiritual rapport that existed between Washington and Hamilton, Jefferson and Washington lived in very different universes when it came to foreign policy and diplomacy. Even though Jefferson was supposed to be in charge of the conduct of foreign policy, it was usually to Hamilton that Washington turned, rather than to Jefferson, when faced with foreign policy issues needing to be resolved. Jefferson grew increasingly bitter over this. A big part of the problem was that Jefferson was, by nature, an intellectual who lived in a world of perfect plans and grand schemes. He was also personally smitten by French culture, had become deeply involved in the Enlightenment dreams of the French intelligentsia that eventually took over the French Revolution and drove it to the slaughter known as the 1793-1794 French Reign of Terror. And even though horrified at the eventual excesses of French republicanism, still favored a working relationship with the French in their ongoing conflict with the English. Footnote. When William Short, a Jefferson supporter, wrote Jefferson from Paris that mobs had taken over the French Revolution and had even butchered some of their French friends, Jefferson wrote back a sharp rebuke. My own affections have been deeply wounded by some of the martyrs to the cause, but rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there an Adam and an Eve left in the country, and left free, it would be better than it now is. End of footnote. Hamilton and Washington, on the other hand, despite the recent war with their English cousins, still considered England as America's best partner when it came to issues involving European politics and economics, which seemed always unavoidable, especially to such a trading people as the Yankees. There really was no way to sidestep the ongoing French-English conflict, and neither France nor England would let the Americans get away with being merely neutral in the struggle. One way or the other, America would constantly have to choose sides, not usually happily, whatever the choice. And in choosing sides, it usually ended up pitting Hamilton and Washington against Jefferson and subsequently also Madison. Jefferson grew increasingly furious about how Washington was lining up behind Hamilton and the pro-British Federalists, and in December of 1793 resigned his position on Washington's cabinet. From then on, he and his Republicans would be active opponents of Washington and his Federalist cabinet. Citizen Genet. This Federalist-Republican conflict came clearly into public view in 1793-1794, when the new French Republic sent Citizen Edmond Charles Genet to America as its diplomatic representative. Jefferson was enthusiastic in receiving this polished Frenchman. Then the problems began. Genet treated America as if it were some poor stepchild. When Washington declared America neutral in the French-English War, Genet began to go around the authority of the president, maneuvering in different ways to involve America in the war on the French side. Genet disregarded all diplomatic protocol by setting up Americans to attack English and Spanish positions in Florida, Louisiana, and Canada, even hiring privateers to attack American shipping heading towards England. Washington was furious, and at this point even Jefferson and Madison were ready to back away from him. In any case, when in 1794, during the French Reign of Terror, the extremely radical Jacobin Party began executing not only enemies of the Revolution, but also the rival revolutionary, though less radical, Girondin Party, of which Genet was himself a member, Genet himself realized that he was now a man on the run. Washington was gracious enough to grant him asylum, and Genet spent the rest of his days quietly in America. Jay's Treaty. Despite the formal signing of the 1783 Treaty of Paris marking the end of the American War of Independence, the British had been disregarding the specific terms of the agreement as if they'd never existed. The British had failed to pay the promised compensation to slave owners whose slaves the British had freed during the war. But on the other hand, America had also failed to keep its promise to compensate American Tories who lost their property when they fled to Canada during the war. Furthermore, the British continued to occupy their forts in the Western Territories and even allied with the Indian tribes to block the spread of the American settlers into those territories. But what was most disturbing was the high-handed way the British impressed sailors. By boarding American ships and seizing sailors they claimed were simply their sailors who had deserted to the easier life under sail in America. In fact, many of these sailors pressed into British naval service were simply the hardiest-looking American sailors and not British at all. To try to get the British to ease up on the impressment and to honor the terms of the treaty, Chief Justice John Jay, a strong Federalist, was sent in 1795 to London to negotiate a better working relationship with the British. But America was in a distinct position of having to negotiate from weakness, at a time when the British were more focused on winning the ongoing struggle with the French than on making the Americans happy. As a consequence, Jay returned from England with a new treaty, it's called Jay's Treaty as it was scornfully termed, that seemingly offered America very little. The idea of Britain compensating the American slave owners for their property loss was dropped, infuriating the Southerners. But America agreed to accept limited trade rights as neutrals in exchange for the British to finally vacate themselves from the American West. Although Jay could not have extracted anything more from the British than what they'd agreed to in this new treaty, Americans of all political shades were outraged. Even Washington came under abusive attack in the press for his acceptance of the treaty. After a bitter debate in Congress, the treaty was approved, barely, by the necessary two-thirds vote in the Senate. But Jefferson's Republicans, holding a strong voting position in the House of Representatives, were determined to block the spending, that is, the appropriations, necessary to bring the treaty to full force. Discussions in the House dragged on for months, with both England and France lobbying representatives to vote up, the British, or down, the French, the necessary legislation. In the end, by a majority of only 3 votes, the House approved the appropriations bill backing the treaty. But the emotional price paid for passage had been very, very high. Jefferson's Republicans had lost no opportunity to slander the Federalists as pro-monarchist because of their pro-British sentiments. The Republicans awarded themselves the title of true Republicans because of their support of French republicanism, Americans not yet having acknowledged the brutality of events in Republican France, and the need to spread anti-monarchical and anti-church republicanism to the rest of the civilized world. Hamilton was greatly slandered by the Republican press for his pro-monarchist loyalties, which are actually not at all the case. But Washington was slandered no less. But the press campaign was very effective. It marked the beginning of the decline of the Federalist Party. Washington refuses to take on a 3rd term as president. Washington had originally agreed to serve only 1 term as president, 1789 to 1793, but had been prevailed upon to run for a 2nd term. However, in 1796, as he approached the time for the elections for a 3rd term in office, he made it very clear that under no circumstances would he continue to serve as president once his 2nd term in office ended in early 1797. He was tired of the bickering between the Federalists and the Republicans and wanted simply to go home to his farm at Mount Vernon. Washington was thus more than willing to oversee a smooth handover in power to his successor, which in this case was his Vice President, John Adams. And so it was that Washington set the constitutional tradition that 2 terms in office was something of a limit to presidential service. America would not be saddled with a president for life, as so frequently happens in new republics. Footnote. President Franklin Roosevelt, however, would run for a 3rd and even 4th term in the 1930s and 1940s, using the emergency of the World War II as justification for doing so. But Washington's 2 terms only presidential tradition was ultimately confirmed as a constitutional amendment, the 22nd, in 1951. John Adams. Although Adams was a staunch Federalist, he was very sensitive to his own place in the scheme of things politically and socially, and found himself frequently at odds with not only Jefferson and his Republicans, but also Hamilton, who, after Washington, was the strongest figure among the Federalists. A man of high moral principle Adams unfortunately was lacking in the tact necessary to put those principles to use without raising a lot of powerful opposition. Sadly, he went largely unappreciated in his own days and by his own people for the way he helped to follow up Washington's lead in bringing the country to even greater stability and security at a time when dangers swirled around the young republic. Adams had grown up in a small Massachusetts town to a family that held strongly to the original Puritan belief and ethics, stressing basic human equality in God's, and thus man's, eyes, the importance of working to achieve rather than merely inheriting one's place in life, and the critical nature of personal integrity, no matter the possible social costs for living true and honestly. Also, in typical Puritan fashion, there was an early emphasis in his family on the importance of formal education, which Adams began at age 6, then continuing into Latin school, and at age 16, entering Harvard College. But he disappointed his father when he dismissed any idea of becoming a minister, and graduated from Harvard instead as a teacher, pondering the question that he faced most of the rest of his life of how to become great. This, of course, put him in conflict with his sense of Puritan morality, a conflict that he would never successfully resolve. Law, nonetheless, seemed to offer the best path to the greatness that he so eagerly sought, and he clerked for a prominent local lawyer, and in 1758 was admitted to the bar and received his master's degree from Harvard. Soon his legal work would draw him into the cause against growing royal authority in the colonies, for which he began to write, anonymously, in the Boston newspapers. In 1764, he married a third cousin and preacher's daughter, Abigail, and proceeded to have 6 children in fairly rapid succession. The last, however, did not survive birth, the second born and first son being future President John Quincy Adams. Adams came to public attention when in 1765 he published a letter sent to the Massachusetts legislature concerning the highly controversial Stamp Act, restating in very clear and compelling terms the rights of Englishmen concerning both taxation and judicial treatment by the authorities. This brought his election to public office as a representative on the town council. In 1768, he moved his family and law practice to Boston, but his law practice did not come into prominence until he defended the British redcoats, accused of murdering members of the Boston crowd, taunting the soldiers. He claimed that he feared that this might damage his reputation, but in fact it led to his taking a Boston seat in the Massachusetts legislature 3 months later, and a considerable increase in his law business. Footnote. Analysts determined that he had skillfully selected just the right jury members, many of whom later became pro-British loyalists, and that from that moment the outcome of the trial was a foregone conclusion. 6 were acquitted and 2 convicted of the lesser crime of manslaughter. Also, his taking the case in the first place may have had some link to his gaining his position on the Massachusetts legislature. Seemingly now, Adams had finally found his path to greatness. But this came amidst growing chaos in Boston, and in 1774, Adams moved his family back to the family farm in Braintree permanently. He, however, continued his work in Boston in the thick of a darkening war cloud. He delivered a hallmark speech in the legislature, challenging the British governor with the reply that Massachusetts had always been self-governing, that its charter was only with the king, not Parliament, and that the colonies would have no other recourse if Massachusetts' rights were not respected by the British authorities than to take the road of full independence from Britain. These ideas were then extensively developed in a publication that clearly outlined the legal arguments behind them. At this point, Adams had secured a very prominent position in the growing debate. Footnote. His more flamboyant cousin, Samuel Adams, being at the time even more prominent, having led the Boston Tea Party, dumping tea in the Boston Harbor in 1773. End of footnote. Quite naturally, Adams was sent by his state as one of its representatives to the First and Second Continental Congresses, 1774 and 1775 to 1777. At first, he was looking for ways to bring Britain and the colonies back into a better relationship. But seeing no flexibility coming from London, he soon found himself working hard to convince his colleagues that full independence was the only path at that point open to the colonies. And in mid-1775, he was the one who put forward the name of Washington as the one to lead the colonial army gathering around Boston, which was a careful move to secure Virginia to this cause. In 1776, he got confirmation for Virginia that with the colony's resolution joining the cause, and was subsequently appointed to the committee assigned the task of drafting a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson wrote most of the draft, but it was Adams who guided its passage through the Continental Congress. Soon after this, Adams was sent with Franklin to hear the terms that General Howe was willing to offer after the series of defeats by Washington's army in New York. But the discussions led nowhere when the American representatives showed no sign of compromising on their decision for full independence. Adams was now a hunted man on the list of treasonous colonials who would have been shown no mercy if the rebellion had finally been put down by the Redcoats. During the next couple of years, Adams worked tirelessly on a number of committees backing the war effort, learning important administrative procedures through his extensive service to the cause. Then in 1778, he was appointed, along with Franklin and another American, to represent the new United States in negotiating a treaty of alliance with France, then returning home, only to be sent back the following year to begin discussions in Paris with British representatives to work out some kind of peace terms. Adams, in the meantime, developing some fluency in the French language. Adams was a contentious person, as he himself well knew, and did not find it easy working with Franklin, whose well-staged, homespun manners that so attracted the French, Adams himself detested with equal vigor. Nonetheless, the British, after the humiliation at Yorktown in 1781, were gradually willing to back down and acknowledge American independence and work out the compromise, land rights to the West and compensation for civilian property losses on both sides of the conflict, that eventually led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783. In the meantime, Adams had been appointed ambassador to the Dutch Republic in 1780, securing that country's recognition of American independence in 1782, and securing valuable loans from Dutch banks needed to help the American states get on their feet after the war. With peace at hand, Adams was appointed in 1785 as America's first ambassador to the English court of St. James, where he sincerely sought to restore friendship between the English-speaking peoples on both sides of the Atlantic. Here in London, he put together another written work, defending the new U.S. Constitution just after its adoption in Philadelphia in 1787. Though not as famous as the Federalist Papers, it was itself a very clear definition of how, in a republic, checks and balances among different branches of the people's government was essential to keeping power operating safely within the bounds that the designers of the Constitution intended. Footnote. Constitutional checks and balances is a concept rather lost on modern Americans who have accorded rather absolute power to the Supreme Court, to a massive and uncontrollably expensive bureaucracy that enforces its own policies on every imaginable subject within American society, and to the presidency, such powers that are now limited solely by the willingness of the presidents to conduct themselves with self-restraint, not something that the realists among the Founding Fathers would have dared trust. End of footnote. When elections for the presidency of the new republic were held in 1789, Adams came in second behind Washington in the count, and thus, by the understanding of the times, becoming the nation's first vice president. But with this, Adams disappeared from public view, as was typical of those called to that office. Washington never drew on Adams' services, never consulted Adams on any issue, leaving Adams resentful against Hamilton, whom the president frequently consulted, and even against the president, whom he visibly supported, but for whom he developed a personal dislike. But at least the office put him in something of a position in 1796 of being the heir apparent to the presidency, when Washington indicated that he definitely was retiring from political service. But he was going to have to face Jefferson and his alliance of mostly Southern Republicans, plus the question as to whether or not Hamilton would put his Federalist supporters behind Adams. He did, because Hamilton despised Jefferson more than he disliked Adams. In the end, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson with his 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68 votes, the voting being almost entirely a northern versus southern state electoral division. Thus, Adams became the nation's new president, and Jefferson, being in second place, became the nation's vice president. The XYZ affair and the Quasi-War. Troubles with Europe continued to rock American politics as Adams assumed his presidential office. But it was now France's turn to play the role of seizing American vessels, hundreds of them. Jefferson and his pro-French Republicans were embarrassed into silence over this French arrogance. As for Hamilton and his pro-British wing of the Federalists, they jumped at this opportunity to demand a declaration of war against the French. Adams sent a delegation to Paris to try to find a remedy to the problem. But the delegation was met by secret agents, X, Y, and Z, who demanded bribes before the Americans would be allowed to meet with French authorities. The Americans refused and returned to the States, with the news of the XYZ affair stirring even greater war fever among the indignant Federalists under the slogan, "Millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute." The conflict finally boiled over in early 1799, when America's new Navy found itself fighting a quasi-war with France on the high seas. Fired up by a major sweep of the 1798 elections, the Federalists now pressed harder for a declaration of war against France. The Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798. But this also raised among nervous Federalists the specter of pro-French treason at home, not too subtly aimed at their Republican rivals. In 1798, the Federalist majority rushed through Congress 4 Alien and Sedition Acts, which Adams unfortunately signed into law, empowering the president to deport pro-French traitors and to penalize any pro-French seditious language that might come from, obviously, Republican newspapers and public speakers. In the end, all this succeeded in doing was to drive the Republicans even deeper in their resolve to oppose the Federalists at all costs. The doctrine of nullification. The strongly Republican southern and western states of Virginia and Kentucky, in bitter reaction to these acts, passed their own resolutions, authored by Jefferson and his ally Madison, affirming that Congress had no constitutional right to intervene in the internal affairs of the states and their people. As the Constitution was the product of the action of the states, or so the Republicans claimed anyway, it was the states, not Congress, that had the last say in what was constitutional and what was not. The states were the ultimate sovereign authority within the Union, not Congress. The states thus reserved for themselves the power to nullify acts of Congress which they regarded as being unconstitutional. This constitutional issue, of course, would be a matter that would continue to be hotly debated until it finally led to full civil war in the mid-1800s. The end of the quasi-war with France. Finally, Adams took matters in his hand to solve this issue, tearing the country apart, and sent an envoy to Paris to negotiate an improvement in U.S.-French relations. In the resultant treaty, the French agreed to leave American shipping alone, thus bringing the quasi-war to an end. The treaty did not at all please the Hamiltonian Federalists, nor did it suffice to restore for Adams friendly relations with the Jeffersonian Republicans. But he signed the treaty anyway, suspecting that by doing so it would end his political career. Indeed, 1 month later, during the second round of presidential elections, Adams was voted out of office, having served only one 4-year term. And thus it was that Adams had given up the presidency in order to bring the country back from the brink of war. The midnight judicial appointments. Interestingly, the very last act of his presidency would be the one thing his presidency that would come to have lasting constitutional value. The creation by Congress and appointment by Adams of individuals to some 6 dozen judicial posts, including the fateful appointment of Virginian John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This was a rush job, ran through by a lame duck Congress of a majority of Federalists. Footnote. The term lame duck was referring to office holders who have been voted out of office in an election that went against them, but who still hold the office for a brief period up until the newly elected officials can take their place. A lot of frantic legislation is often passed by a lame duck assembly, realizing that it is about to lose power to its opponents. Many of these congressmen had just lost the federal elections to a new Jeffersonian Republican majority, but had a few weeks of time remaining in office before the newly elected Congress could take its place in the new capital city of Washington, D.C., actually a forlorn collection of shacks, muddy lanes, and farm animals. In fact, the job was so rushed that Adams spent his last night in office completing the task of making these judicial appointments, thus earning them the reputation from the Republicans as the midnight judges. With this last act of public service completed, Adams quietly slipped away from the Capitol to his home in Massachusetts, a rather tired and bitter old man. He hadn't even bothered to stay long enough to see the new President of the United States, his once close colleague but now bitter rival, Jefferson, sworn into office. But once again, the simplicity of this procedure would demonstrate that in America, political culture, defeat in an election meant not a prolonged challenge to the results by a resentful loser, but a peaceful transfer of power to the winner. It had been that way since the founding of the Anglo-American Society in the early 1600s, and would continue as an important political tradition into this new era of Republican government. Footnote. That important principle, however, seems to have been abandoned in the 2016 election, which brought the Republican Trump to the White House. Democrats not only went to the streets in loud protest over the results, but Democrat congressmen and women, supported by a very liberal press corps, began immediately to look for grounds to impeach Trump for having committed high crimes and misdemeanors. This is third world politics, typical of what happens in elections, should they even have them, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For America, this constitutes a grand departure from America's great constitutional tradition.